Hello, my name is Adam Racer. I'm a senior undergraduate student from Towson University, and over the spring semester, I partook in an internship at the Shafer Center. The Shafer Center is a special education school where children with autism who have severe autism and a decent amount of problem behaviors that makes it so that they can't function within like a traditional classroom setting. They get sent to this school, and we intervene behaviorally and in their education so that they can learn skills and learn new behaviors that make it so that they can more functionally operate and behave within a more traditional school setting. So the first thing I want to mention is just different ways I grew personally. Oftentimes with our clients, they are oftentimes nonverbal or have deficits in social and communication abilities. So a lot of times like they have difficulty communicating what they want. So what we will often do is we will have these things called augmented and alternative communication devices, or AAC for short. And what we will do is we will model, like there will be buttons on their device that communicate different speech functions. And oftentimes what we will do is we will model different ways of communicating on that device so that we can better understand their needs. And they can learn how to communicate so that if they do go off to another school, they can use that device to communicate if, as a way to replace, traditional spoken communication. And the way that's helped me grow personally is that I've spent a lot of time like improving that skill, like modeling like different communication on that device to the students I work with. And I think modeling communication has really helped me grow in the areas of identifying the students' needs and teaching them how to communicate more functional ways of, getting what they want. So for example, like a student might have a tantrum if they're hungry, and because of the practice I have showing them how to communicate that they're hungry on their communication device, I have been able to identify the antecedents of behavior more effectively. And I've been able to show them, like I've been able to identify the function behind a certain behavior. So for example, if a student is like throwing things and, having a tantrum, I've been able to show them like, hey, looks like you're hungry. You can show me on your device, I am hungry. And the reason I bring that up is because me personally, I think it's improved my skill in identifying what is maintaining certain behaviors and what the function behind certain behaviors is, and showing them new ways of getting that, new ways of maintaining that function. Another way I've grown in, my own personal development in this internship is by watching my supervisor, Bianca. When she observes me and when she's in meetings, she's very professional. She's very much a blank slate. Like, especially when she's observing me, there's times where I'm like, am I doing this right? I don't know. And I'll kind of look at her and she won't give me any kind of reaction at all, just so she can see what I do independently. However, when we talk about my future there professionally, and when we talk, outside of the meeting, she's very warm and down to earth. And so she's not being like neutral because she doesn't like interacting with other people. It's more so, having a blank screen approach, being very neutral, like not giving certain behaviors or reaction is a skill she has developed and something I've learned from. And I think that's a good skill to have, when you're maintaining a client to therapist relationship. And I like how I'm getting it now in undergrad, so that like I'm learning, reacting to certain behaviors when I leave school one day. I think that's a good skill to have just professionally, so that like, you can establish like what the role of the client, what the role of the therapist is. So the next part of the internship I want to discuss are the most and least interesting parts of the internship. As far as like the most interesting is, I think taking data was super fascinating because, in behavioral therapy, a big part of it is taking data and, watching patterns of behavior change over time. And that's been really helpful for my own development as well. And I find it really interesting because you can have really good days and really bad days, and, days where you have stronger emotions like, oh, that day was so rough, or yay, that day was so good, can influence like how you think about progress being made. But like being able to take data and track it over time has been really fascinating to me, because it's like, okay, even when I have really bad days, I can look at that and be like, okay, that was just a one-off bad day. The overall trend is pretty good. Or it can help me identify blind spots in my own, competency, I guess, if you want to say, where I can be like, oh, I felt like that was really good. But days where I look at data and it's actually not going as good, I think that kind of like mitigates, my own bias and like outcomes I want to see. So that's been really fascinating. Probably one of my more favorite parts of what I'm doing. I think it's a strength of behavioral therapy. As far as the least interesting parts of this internship, I would say just like cleaning up after students, like after the school day is ended. I'm cleaning up classrooms and I'm laminating paper and I'm like sending emails. Like the administrative part of this internship, like the administrative responsibilities I had, I understand why they're there. And we all at Shafer couldn't do our job without it, because we need materials to give the kids and we need to make sure everything's neat and tidy for the next day. So I get why it's important, but it's just very time consuming and monotonous. And like, I understand why it's important, but it's also like my least favorite part of the day. Like, I'm only with students from 9 a.m. to like 2:30. So the other hours of the day are just doing like, prep tasks. So I understand why they're important, but it's kind of the most boring part of the day oftentimes. As far as the expectations of the objectives and outcomes of this internship, I feel like they were met. I feel like all the learning objectives were met. At first I was super nervous. The concept of like being really hands-on with other people's kids in a population I'm not really familiar with working with before this internship really freaked me out. I was super nervous. I was like, oh, this is someone else's kid. Like, am I gonna do a good job? Like, am I gonna make things worse because I'm new? And at first it was really nerve-wracking, but it's one of those things where since like behavioral therapy, like applied behavioral analysis in this case, is really systematic, and it's really by the book, and an aim of it is making sure that it's systematic so that all of the employees are following very specific procedures when compared to other kinds of therapy. Like other kinds of therapy, like more humanistic therapy is more vague and open-ended. This is very specific about what is expected of me. So I think that kind of aspect of ABA really helped because it's like the more I did it, the more I knew what was expected of me, and the more I could clearly define like what needed to be done. The more I did it. So I think like the longer I did it, the more I was able to establish like antecedents. I was able to establish like what the behavior actually looked like in the student I was working with, and establishing like what alternative consequences we should use for a specific behavior. Where at first it was like I'd never done it, I didn't even know where to start. So I think after this internship, like I have experience doing it a certain amount of time, over a certain amount of time, that like I can establish like generally, it might look different student to student, but generally I'm able to get a gist of like what the process is generally like. And when it comes to the new things I learned about behavioral therapy, ABA practices, is this is something where like looking back, it's something I would have known, but like it's really been cemented in my mind after having some experience doing it. But like when you're trying to find new ways to reinforce, or trying to find ways at all to reinforce a certain behavior, what worked one day might not work another. Like a good example of this is like, if your favorite food is pasta and you find that really reinforcing, if you eat pasta every single day, you're eventually going to get tired of it. So like playing on the playground for one student might be really reinforcing, but if they have that over and over, they might get tired of it. So like being able to think of new ways to positively reinforce certain behaviors that you want to see more of in students is like a constant ongoing process. At the initial intake with a student, they might find something really reinforcing, but that might fade over time, and then you kind of have to adapt the plan, as that comes up. Like, they might find being on their iPad really reinforcing, but then they might phase out of that and, not find it as reinforcing as they used to. So what I've really realized about ABA that I didn't know or wasn't as familiar with before was that like it's something that's constantly like being tweaked and assessed and reworked to fit the student. And being able to think quickly and on your feet to find appropriate ways to tweak a plan is a skill you're going to have to get used to, and something that they really cemented into me as a person in my time there. Something else I've learned about the field of behavioral therapy is that, especially when working with children, like it's not just the time, like the skills they learn aren't just learned at school in my time with the students. Like having these skills be implemented by the parents, by the family, by the other people in the student's life in natural context is really what's going to make or break the work I do with a student. Like I could do really good work from 9 to 2 o'clock with a student, but if they go home and, the family isn't implementing like communication methods, or, being like systematic about not reinforcing certain behaviors at home, that's really going to make or break what happens. So I think like if you want to go into working with children, especially in like behavioral therapy, ABA, like consulting with parents and teaching them about what you're doing in an accessible way is really like going to be your bread and butter of working with children, especially autistic children, but children in general. So that's something new. Like the new things I've learned about the field of, behavioral interventions are things where if you told me before, I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. But actually having experience with it has really like drilled into my mind how important things like that are. One thing I also learned on this internship is, it's not like, I use the word behavioral therapy a lot, behavioral therapy, ABA. It's not like therapy how you might traditionally think of it, like one person sitting here, another person sitting across from me, and us talking about our problems. It's not so much that, but there's still a lot of the same ethical principles that are applied from that kind of therapy to more behavioral interventions that I do at Shafer. And something I learned about the ethics of what I do is confidentiality. It's very, very important. Like one of the things I'm assessed on by my supervisor is like not talking about the student with my other coworkers. Like, yeah, we're in a classroom, we observe, we're there seeing each other like work with our students. But like when it comes to like after hours, when it comes to like our lunch breaks, we're really not supposed to talk about the child and how they're doing and how our day went. That way, like you're not talking about like the student's plan and behavior outside of purposes for like communication and education and training. Like, for example, like if I had a rough day with a student, I wouldn't go into the break room at lunch and be like, oh, this, and this happened. The same way like a traditional therapist wouldn't meet up after hours with another therapist and be like, oh, my client said this, and this to me, because it might not seem like it because it's a school, but like the same rules of like confidentiality and, honoring their privacy and the dignity of the student still applies here. So that's something like when I'm being assessed by my supervisor, that's also something she's looking for. Like, are you talking about the student to your coworker outside of like communication for like training and, the purposes of being systematic of working with that student? Are you talking about them appropriately? Are you also making sure not to talk about the student to your coworkers? Even if it is appropriate, you never talk about the student to your coworkers in front of the student, because nobody would like that. Like if you're in therapy and your therapist is talking about you in front of someone else, you wouldn't like that either. So that's something like in the area of confidentiality that like is expected of me and my coworkers at this internship. Something else that's been expected of me at my internship, especially in like ABA, like using empirical research to guide our practices is like a big part of what we do. And I attempted to use research to work with this one student who was having a really difficult time. And I was looking at the research and it seemed like a pretty plausible thing to do. I was using research on shaping, which is like rewarding successive approximations of a desired behavior, meaning like instead of rewarding the final product of what you want to see, you reward like little steps at a time to kind of build skills. So if someone's learning a skill for the first time, say for example, putting on their pants, which is something we often do at Shafer, like a lot of kids don't use the bathroom independently. And so we're trying to teach them and reinforce them to do that. but we don't expect them to learn it in one day. What we might do is like reward them by, if they pick up their pants but don't put it on, we'll reward it so that they can kind of, okay, I picked up my pants and I got reinforced for that. And then maybe once they start to put it in, we'll, put their pants on, we'll reward them a little bit more. So we're kind of building the skill a little bit at a time. And I tried to do this, and there's research from Skinner showing that shaping works. There's also more research in more recent times showing that shaping does work. For example, Berardi et al. Found that shaping smoking behaviors little by little, like, if someone went one less day without smoking, or, reduced the smoke particles in their house a little bit by little bit, and they were reinforced by each reduction in smoke particles they had, it did lead to significantly less smoking. So I thought, the student I'm working with is taking a long time to put on their pants, so let me try and reinforce it little by little. However, they had already they've already learned this skill. It's just when they're working with new people, they try and get away with not doing it to see how much I know and how much I'm going to expect from them. And so this didn't work out. I tried to reinforce this skill little by little, but they already know how to do the skill. They already know how to put on their pants. They already know how to sit down on the toilet and wash their hands. They just aren't really motivated to do so. And I thought they didn't know how to do it. So I'm trying to implement a practice where you're building a skill little by little, but since it was already in place and they already know how to, toilet on their own, when I would reward them little by little, they were probably thinking, oh, I've done everything I need to do. So it didn't quite work out. I think the answer I got from that research was like, shaping can work, but you have to use it appropriately. If someone has already learned a skill and already has all the steps in place, then rewarding them little by little might actually cause that skill to deteriorate and make them complete less steps of it. So something else I found super fascinating when applying research to practical experience in my internship was that working with autistic kids, it's important to know that the DSM currently identifies criteria for autism to include social deficits and like deficits in communication, deficits in, interpersonal communication socially. And what I have actually found is that there's a growing body of research showing that this criteria in the DSM might need a little bit of tweaking and reworking in future editions of the DSM. For example, research from Crompton et al. From 2020 shows that when you take neurotypical people and have them communicate with each other, they can understand each other just fine. When you take autistic people and have them communicate with other autistic people, they can understand each other just fine. They can get the gist of a message. They can take away the information from their peer that they need to understand and apply just fine. However, when you mix autistic people and neurotypical people and have them communicate, that's oftentimes when the communication starts to deteriorate. I find that super fascinating because, as a society and in psychological practice, there's this idea that autistic people, have a harder time and have higher deficits in communication and social competency. But what that research is actually finding is that maybe it's just that autistic people have their own way with each other of communicating that doesn't match the statistical majority of neurotypical people. And, maybe that could mean that future research is actually showing that, maybe that criteria needs reworked a little bit. I think that's impacted maybe the way I see some of my students compared to how some of my other coworkers see my students. Like, I think if my students are communicating in a certain way, or if they're playing with toys in a certain way, I kind of just let it go compared to my other coworkers, which maybe I'm wrong for that, maybe I'm missing something. But I think, like, I'm more focused on problem behaviors rather than like social communication and, social reciprocity. I think that's less of a priority for me based on that research than compared to my coworkers. So I think that has very much influenced, like, my priorities working at Shafer. But yeah, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation, hearing me out. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. I really love working here at Shafer. I love when people are curious about what I do. And yeah, if you have any questions, anything that needs clarified, I would love to talk about it. So yeah, thanks for watching.